Like Sam Bankman-Fried, I am on a bit of a crusade against the current FTX attorneys, Sullivan and Cromwell, because I, like Sam Bankman-Fried, believe that they, at best, have fudged the truth in a variety of ways so as to enrich themselves, and at worst, have lied in order to cover up crimes that they have committed and also to enrich themselves, all at the expense of FTX customers. Now, FTX customers are in fact suing Sullivan and Cromwell over some of these claims. And in this fight between the FTX customers, myself, and of all people, Sam Bankman-Fried, we have gained some unexpected and perhaps unwitting allies in the form of Senators Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Grassley. Charles Grassley, Chuck Grassley from Iowa. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, we're going to talk about this. I think it is a very interesting piece of, frankly, bad news for Sullivan and Cromwell, the current FTX attorneys who I've been talking about quite a bit on this program. But before we get into that, if you have been enjoying this content, welcome to the Carly P. Riley Show. Please consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, commenting below. I really appreciate it. Okay, so last week, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Grassley sent a joint letter to the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and one of the leading regulatory bodies that oversaw FTX US. And they asked that the CFTC hand over all of their correspondence, all of their records of everything having to do with Sam Bankman-Fried, FTX, Alameda Research, et cetera, basically anything that existed in Sam Bankman-Fried's orbit, whether that was emails sent by colleagues of his employees to the CFTC, whether there was phone calls that were had between the various parties, meetings between the various parties, anything like that. They want all the information about it. If it was an in-person meeting, they want the notes from the meetings. They want to know everything that was said, everything that happened between the CFTC and Sam Bankman-Fried and the affiliated entities and individuals. Now, it's so interesting because Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Grassley are clearly interested in understanding if the current CFTC and current CFTC chair had any knowledge of what was going on at FTX or any knowledge of the fraud. The tone of the letter to me seems to indicate that they want to make sure that nothing suspicious or untoward was happening within the CFTC and their relationship with Sam Bankman-Fried. And that is certainly a noble and worthy goal. I don't know enough about it if there are reasons to suspect that the CFTC was in some ways compromised or being negligent in their duties. And if that's the case, I certainly would like to know about that. But it is actually not that is most interesting to me about this letter. And it may have you going, okay, what does this even have to do with Sullivan and Cromwell? Well, it's this. Sullivan and Cromwell were the attorneys for FTX and were attorneys specifically for FTX US prior to its collapse. Now, you've heard me say ad nauseum how frustrating and how bizarre it is that attorneys that in any way represented FTX US prior to its collapse were allowed to stay on as the attorneys after the collapse. Basically, they were attorneys for a company that went down for one of the most high-profile frauds of all time, and after the fact, they were given a promotion and a raise. That's crazy, but that's another episode that I have made several times. But that's to give you a little bit of the background. Now, Sullivan and Cromwell have claimed, oh, we only did a little bit of work for FTX US. It was just some bit work here and there. Bit work that made them $8.6 million in the course of basically a year, but I digress. The point is, they have said they only did a little bit of work for FTX US. But we know that a big chunk of that work, bit or not, that they did involved them being a liaison and being sort of the key people, the key men going between the CFTC and FTX. Because one of Sullivan and Cromwell's specialties is navigating these regulatory requirements, these regulatory institutions, because they have really good relationships with, for example, the CFTC. And in fact, we know that Sullivan and Cromwell were involved in some amount of misrepresentations that FTX made to the CFTC while FTX was trying to acquire certain licenses, certain approvals from the CFTC. Now, we only know a little bit about some of the communications that existed between FTX and the CFTC and a little bit about the misrepresentations that were made. We don't know if in preparing these things that turned out to be misrepresentations, if Sullivan and Cromwell knew at the time that they were lying to the CFTC or simply took at face value things that they were being told and didn't know that they were lying to the CFTC. But getting a more holistic picture about what the communications look like between FTX and the CFTC will give us a lot more information about just how broad and deep the misrepresentations run. And again, we know that Sullivan and Cromwell's fingerprints were all over all of that because frankly, that is one of the key reasons that they were hired. One of the key reasons they even worked for FTX US in the first place was because of those relationships with the CFTC. Now, something else to consider in all of this, something else very interesting, is that on November 11th, 2022, which is the day that all of the FTX international entities were put into bankruptcy. So we are talking about Peak chaos, peak crisis. Everything is imploding at FTX at this point. And they're, fog of war. On that exact same day, somebody withdrew that application from the CFTC on November 11th. So specifically, it says on the CFTC website, it says on Friday, November 11th, counsel for LedgerX LLC, FTX DBA doing business as FTX US Derivatives. So LedgerX was like the shorthand name for a company. It was a company that FTX had acquired, and that was specifically the subsidiary of FTX that had applied for a particular license within the CFTC. So on November 11th, counsel for LedgerX submitted to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission's Division of Clearing and Risk a formal withdrawal of FTX's request, originally submitted on December 6th, to amend FTX's whatever, blah, blah, blah. Basically, that this is them putting out this notice saying that this application had been withdrawn. Now, it has long been wondered why, in the midst of all that chaos, all of that crisis, why somebody's priority was withdrawing an application from the CFTC for a business that was a subsidiary of FTX, a business that frankly would have been more valuable and easier to sell for parts as part of the bankruptcy later on if it had gotten this licensure application approved. Like, why was this somebody's priority? Now, it's entirely possible there's a very legitimate, normal reason for that, but there's also the reason that is somebody knew that there were misrepresentations on that application, or somebody was afraid that the misrepresentations were going to now be discovered in light of everything that was going on. And by withdrawing this application, it was a cover your ass scenario. I don't know. Certainly, it seems likely that somebody realizing that there were misrepresentations on there is why this was withdrawn. What level of criminality or cover-up there is as part of this, it's unclear. But presumably, if all correspondences are genuinely turned over, all of the correspondences between FTX and the CFTC, we will see the correspondence, or Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Grassley, I guess, at a minimum, will see the correspondence in which FTX asked for this license application to be revoked. And it would be very interesting to see the reasons they gave. Maybe it's simple, maybe there's nothing there, but it would be interesting to see nevertheless. So I say all this to say, while Senators Warren and Grassley are maybe interested in understanding what the CFTC knew and when, and good on them. Frankly, I am interested in that as well. I will be curious to see if this casts any more inquiry into Sullivan and Cromwell when they see the scope of the communications, when they look into the communications. Will it raise any further suspicions about Sullivan and Cromwell? Or are Sullivan and Cromwell already insulated and protected for various reasons because they have connections in all of these places? They're well connected within the DOJ, the Department of Justice. I don't know. But to me, this is not good news for Sullivan and Cromwell. Whatever this is, doesn't bode well that the communications between these two groups be uncovered, because all it can do is reinforce the fact that Sullivan and Cromwell were either criminally involved in whatever was going on, or negligent, bad attorneys for not realizing that something was going on and they were making misrepresentations to this regulatory body. Either way, it doesn't look good for them. And frankly, I would like there to be more scrutiny on this law firm. So that is why I talk about it here. And that is why I am interested in this piece of news. If you also found this interesting, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, commenting below. And with that, I will see you next time.